Chapter number 1, a triumph of surgery. A triumph means a victory, and surgery, that means hospital or maybe an operation, okay, any kind of medical treatment. A triumph of surgery, that means a hospital's victory or an operation's victory. So, what this title is referring to, let's find out. First of all, Tricky. Tricky is the name of a small dog who is pampered and overfed by his rich mistress. The mistress name is Mrs. Pomfrey. He falls seriously ill. Tricky falls seriously ill, and his mistress, that means Mrs. Pomfrey, consults a veterinary surgeon. Does he perform an operation? So here it is about surgery. And does the dog recover? So we would find out what kind of operation the doctor carries out and how does the dog recover. Here it is to read and find out. Why is Mrs. Pumphrey about Tricky? Means what was Tricky's problem? What happens to him? And why was Mrs. Pumphrey worried? Next one is what does she do to help him? Is she wise in this? Means what does Mrs. Pumphrey do to help Tricky? And what she did, was she correct in this or not? Who does I refer to in this story? Who is I here? So first sentence, that is beginning with I. We shall complete only part 1 in this video. So for part 2 and 3, you are to watch the next videos. I was really worried about Tricky this time. I was really worried means till now, if you are not able to find out who this I is, you can read further. Then you will be able to identify. I had pulled up my car when I saw him in the street with his mistress, and I was shocked at his appearance. He had become hugely fat, like a blotted sausage, with the leg at each corner. His eyes, bloodshot and rheumy, stared straight ahead, and his tongue lolled from his jaws. First of all, you can get the idea that I is the author of the story. Okay, author or the narrator means who is telling us the story, who has written this story. I is referring to that person. Apart from that, I is the veterinary doctor here. This means the author himself is the veterinary doctor, and the author and the doctor, these are same person, and he is saying sharing the story of Tricky. So the story begins with the concern of the doctor about Tricky. Means the doctor or the writer, he was really worried about Tricky that time. Why? He had pulled up his car, and when he saw him in the street, means when the author saw him in the street, Tricky was there with his mistress, Mrs. Pomfrey. The author was surprised to see his appearance. Now, this is how Tricky looks. Tricky had become hugely fat. It looked like a blotted sausage with that a leg each corner. His eyes bloodshot and rheumy and stared. Rheumy means bloodshot means deep red, and rheumy means watery. Stared straight ahead, and his tongue lolled from his jaws. So this was Tricky's condition. Okay. Mrs. Pomfrey hastened to explain. He was so listless. Mrs. Pomfrey is explaining about Tricky's behavior. She said that he was so listless, he was so lazy. Mr. Harriet. So this is the name of the doctor or the name of the writer. Okay, James Harriet. The writer of the story is James Harriet, and he is the veterinary doctor as well. So Mrs. Pomfrey said that he was so listless. Mr. Harriet, he seemed to have no energy. I thought he must be suffering from malnutrition. So I have been giving him some little extras between meals to build him up. See the first question. Why is Mrs. Pomfrey worried about Tricky? So you can add this description of Tricky because he had become hugely fat. Okay. Apart from that, he has become so lazy, and it seemed that he had no energy. That's why Mrs. Pomfrey was worried about Tricky. Now what does she do to help him? What does Mrs. Pomfrey do? She said that she thought he must be suffering from malnutrition, so she had been giving him some little extras between meals to build him up. Some malt and cod liver oil and a ball of Horlicks at night to make him sleep. Nothing much really. So this was what Mrs. Pomfret did. So is she wise in this? No, she was not wise on this. And did you cut down on the sweet things as I told you? This is the dialogue by the doctor. The doctor asked Mrs. Pomfrey if she had cut down the sweet things. Then she said, "Oh, I did for a bit, but he seemed to be so weak, I had to relent." Means I had to restart it. Means I could not resist myself from giving him sweets because he wanted to have it. He does love cream cakes. Means this shows that Mrs. Pomfrey loved Tricky so much. She was means she loved her dog so much, and she was over caring. She was overfeeding Tricky. Then she said, "Tricky loved cream cakes and chocolates. I can't bear to refuse him." So, what do you think? Was she wise in this? So, no, she was not wise in this. She had to cut down his diet, but she was adding more and more and more. Okay, so first two questions has been answered. Now, third one is, who does I refer to in this story? This I have already told you. I is the narrator of the story. I is the author of the story. Apart from that, I is the veterinary doctor in the story. Okay, that is James Harriet. So all three questions have been done. Now read ahead. Then she said, "I looked down again." Means the author looked down again at the little dog. That was the trouble. Means this was the trouble. What was the trouble? Tricky is only for, means this was the trouble. That means Mrs. Pumphrey was overfeeding Tricky. And Tricky's fault. What was Tricky's fault? It was his greed. He had never been known to refuse food. Means Tricky is always ready to eat. Okay, he can eat more and more and more. Means he was becoming greedy day by day. He could not deny food. He would tackle a meal at any hour of the day or night. And I wondered about all the things Mrs. Pomfrey had not mentioned. Are you giving him plenty of exercise? So exercise is also very important for pets as well. So then the doctor asked Mrs. Pomfrey if she had given him the exercise. Then she said, "Well, he has a little walks with me, as you can see, but Hoggin, the gardener, has been down with lumbago, so there has been no ring throwing lately." That means the gardener who was assigned the task, okay, who was assigned this task to take care Tricky's exercises. So he had been down, right? He was not feeling well for last few days. So there has been no ring throwing lately. That means Tricky was not having any kind of exercises. I tried to sound severe. Now I really mean this. If you don't cut his food right down and give him more exercise, he is going to be really ill. Now the doctor is warning Mrs. Pumphrey that you have to give him more exercises and you have to cut down his diet. You must harden your heart and keep him on a very strict diet. Mrs. Pomfrey wrung her hands. "Oh, I will, Mr. Harriet." Means now once again Mrs. Pomfrey ensured that yes, she will do, but the doctor knew very well that Mrs. Pomfrey could not do this. "I am sure you are right, but it is so difficult, so difficult." She set off head down along the road as if determined to put the new regime into practice immediately. Means Mrs. Pomfrey was showing that she would do this, but the doctor was sure that she is not going to do this because she could not do this. Okay, because she loved her dog so much. I watched their progress with growing concern. Tricky was tottering along in his little tweed coat. He had a whole wardrobe of these coats. Now, in this part of the chapter, Tricky's lifestyle had been shared and what happened to him then. Okay, so Tricky was having a wardrobe full of coats for the cold weather, raincoat for the wet days. He struggled on, dropping in his harness. I thought it would not be long before I heard from Mrs. Pomfrey. That means the doctor was sure that soon he would be going to have an emergency call from Mrs. Pomfrey, and the expected call came within a few days. Mrs. Pomfrey was distraught. Tricky would eat nothing. Means now Tricky became seriously ill. His condition worsened, okay, worsened and refused even his favorite dishes. Now Mrs. Pomfrey is explaining means what was Tricky's condition. Tricky was not eating anything. Even he was refusing his favorite dishes, and besides he had bouts of vomiting. He was vomiting continuously. He spent all his time lying on a rug, panting, didn't want to go for walks, didn't want to do anything. I had made my plans in advance. Means now the doctor was sure that he would be going to, means he would be going to have a call very soon, so he had already made his plans. The only way was to get Tricky out of the house for a period. Means what was the solution now? The doctor had to take Tricky away from Mrs. Pomfrey. I suggested that he be hospitalized for about a fortnight. Fortnight means 15 days. Okay. So the doctor suggested Mrs. Pomfrey to hospitalize Tricky for 15 days and to be kept under observation. The poor lady almost swooned. That means Mrs. Pomfrey could not bear this. She was almost like falling unconscious. She was sure he would pine and die if he did not see her every day. But I took a firm line. Tricky was very ill, and this was the only way to save him. Now, Dr. James Harriet, he became a little harsh, and he said that, Ma'am, this is the only way we can treat Tricky. Otherwise, I can't help you. So, in fact, I thought it best to take him without delay, and followed by Mrs. Pomfrey's wailings, I marched out of the car carrying the little dog wrapped in a blanket. Now, the lifestyle. Okay, means when the author was ready to take Tricky away from Mrs. Pomfrey, what was happening around? The entire staff was roused and maids rushed in and out, bringing his day bed, night bed, favorite cushions, toys, rubber rings, breakfast bowl, lunch bowl, supper bowl. Realizing that my car would never hold all this stuff, I started to drive away. Means the author was not having a brand new car and a very luxury car. It was a simple car. So he was in a, means he was thinking that the car would not bear all this weight, so he started to drive away. As he moved off, Mrs. Pomfrey, with a despairing cry, threw an armful of the little coats through the window. I looked in the mirror before I turned the corner of the drive. Everybody was in tears. Means everybody was crying. Out on the road, I glanced down at the pathetic little animal gasping on the seat by my side. So, who is this pathetic little animal? This is a Tricky. Okay, this is referring to Tricky. Tricky was sitting on the seat by the doctor's side or by the author's side. I patted the head and Tricky made a brave effort to wag his tail. Brave effort, that means it was very difficult for Tricky to even to wag his tail. Okay, so that this is showing that Tricky was really very ill. Poor old lad, I said, you haven't a kick in you, but I think I know a cure for you. Means the doctor was in a hope that he would treat Tricky very easily. So this is the first part of this chapter. In this chapter, we came to know about these three questions. Uh, 1 minute. Yes. First one is, why is Mrs. Pomfrey worried about Tricky? What does she do to help him? Is she wise in this? Who does I refer to in this story? Apart from that, what happened to Tricky? How was his lifestyle? And the character sketch of Mrs. Pomfrey as well, and the physical appearance of Tricky as well. Apart from that, what does Miss Mr. James Harriet? How was he as a doctor? Okay, so these are some points we covered in this first part of the story. Okay, in the next video we shall cover the next part, and in the last video, means in the upcoming videos, we shall discuss the question asks, extra question asks of this chapter also. Okay, so this is all for today's video. Thank you.